Chapter 6. The funeral was beautiful. Everyone said so. Creation itself honored the passing of Lord and Lady Havencroft, with a glorious summer sun shining through a clear blue sky, as if heaven itself had broken open for this particular day. The procession into Lexicon Basilica was appropriately long and solemn, accompanied by the full weight of the organ crying out with majestic homage. A deluge of black gowns, black veils, and black suits flooded the pews, until there was a veritable sea of darkness in that bright place, challenging the colorful shafts of light raining down from the stained glass. One casket followed at the rear. Only one. Baltair and Asena Havencroft wore the Matri in life, symbolizing their mutual bond as each other's Codex. Now they would wear one in death, holding hands until the scroll of the world was closed forever at the end of all things. So are the old ways that should never be forgotten. The rest of the funeral page was lost on Nesta. She remembered Archabbot Matthias saying something about life and death and the power of Da's word over the silence of mortality, but she remembered very little else, nor did it seem important to her. What seemed far more pressing and concerning was the lack of tears running down her face. She felt sad, inconsolable really, but when it mattered most for her to cry, to appear to others to be grieving, she couldn't. How cold she must have seemed to that flood of black bearing down on her, threatening to drown her in their judgment. But she couldn't. And how awful it felt to be focusing on herself and her inability to cry, when her own parents were gone from her life forever. Surely they deserved her attention and respect. But she couldn't help it. As Archabbot Matthias prattled on, all she could think of was how she couldn't produce a single drop of grief for the world to see. Was she really that selfish? And then she remembered. She had cried, and cried, and cried. The night they died, the entire next day, and the day after. A full week had passed since that awful evening, and she had poured herself out like a summer shower that eventually exhausts its rain. And she was exhausted. Grief is exhausting, and there's no escape from it. It seems but a dream that one will wake from at any moment, but the waking never happens. And on it goes, aching every heartstring and brain cell until everything is a blur, and the only thing that remained was that everyone said it was beautiful. She had to take their word for it, for she simply hadn't noticed. Barrett was her only source of comfort. He shared her grief, though his was different than hers. She was their daughter, he a dear friend. What Nesta longed for was her sister Paige, but she was away at Drakmord attending to the family estate as well as to the future of the estate, for she was pregnant with the heir of Drakmord and unable to travel the far distance to the funeral. Though her absence was understandable, unintended, and even excusable, it was keenly felt by Nesta, and hurt none the less, adding to the void that overtook her heart. What she desperately desired above all was a sisterly affection that no other affection could imitate or replace. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Barrett was seated across from her in the carriage. His shoulders were slumped and his head slightly bowed as if the weight of the world rested there. He still wore black as she did, including a black armband that was hardly noticeable as it so perfectly blended in with the black jacket he wore. "I have to," she said defiantly. She began tracing invisible words in the air for practice, as she had been doing only a short while ago, waiting at the train station for her parents. Now she did it to forget her pain and distract her troubled thoughts. Thinking was her worst enemy right now. It was crippling. Any thought about her parents either threw her into uncontrollable rage or unutterable sorrow, and she could afford neither. So she practiced her words instead. The carriage stopped in front of the police headquarters. Barrett stepped out of the carriage door first and offered the aid of his hand to Nesta. She gladly accepted it, grateful to be reminded that even if she didn't have Paige with her, she was far from being alone. The police headquarters stood as a temple of justice in Bastille, and its edifice certainly looked the part. Great limestone pillars stood out front, supporting a triangular roof depicting Lady Justice holding her scales in her hand. Under her were an army of valiant men holding swords, keeping the peace and protecting the citizens of Bastille. Nesta couldn't help but scorn the incompetency in fulfilling their duty. Her appointment with the police commissioner was known to the secretary, and they were escorted immediately to the office at the top floor. It was a magnificent room, lined with red oak paneling and intricate crown molding near the ceiling. The floor was a beautiful oak as well, with one massive Corian rug dominating its center with a somber teal. The Commissioner was seated behind his imposing dark wood desk, with an entire wall of bookcases displaying various accolades and achievements serving as a backdrop. The man himself was rather less impressive. Short, thin, and bald, with red-turning white mustache, Commissioner Blantyre looked more the clerk than the chief. Yet from what Nesta had gathered, the red in his mustache was no lie, and the man that wore it boasted an energy and a temper that aided him greatly in his never-ending fight against crime. "Please come in," he said quickly, as he leapt from his chair and walked across the long room toward them. "Can I get you anything to drink? Water? Perhaps something a bit stronger?" Barrett and Nesta took their seats in front of the desk and shook their heads politely declining the offer. "Very well," said Commissioner Blantyre. He returned to his seat and leaned forward, pressing his sharp elbows onto the desk. "Before we begin, I'd like to offer my condolences for what they're worth, and my apologies." "Sir?" asked Nesta, confused. "Your parents were the pride of this city as far as I'm concerned," he said sincerely. "They represented true nobility, and not many of our noble families can claim that. It was their hope to use their resources, intelligence, and influence to make the world a better place, and they paid the ultimate price for that hope. They shouldn't have, mind you. It was under our watch that this travesty happened." His voice began to rise. 20 of our finest officers were there that night, to ensure safety for your parents and the guests of Gallier Academy. And we failed. We failed them. And we failed you, Lady Nesta. And I am heartily sorry for that failure. It shames me." Nesta didn't know what to say. She couldn't find the words to say. "Thank you, Commissioner," said Barrett finally. "Your words mean a lot to us during this difficult time." Nesta blushed with shame for not speaking first. Yes, she forced herself to say, wanting at least to say something of kindness to this honorable man. It was an impossible situation, one that nobody could have predicted. It was nobody's fault but the perpetrator of this heinous act. Fresh tears wetted her cheeks. She took a handkerchief out of her handbag and dabbed them away. They were not from grief, but from saying words that were only half true. Even though she knew the police were not to blame for the death of her parents, she couldn't help but still hold them responsible to some degree. The fact that she couldn't bring herself to say such things made her even more frustrated and even more ashamed of her own coldness and callousness. "Ah, yes, the perpetrator," fumed Commissioner Blantyre. "Very odd business, that. I suspect that's the reason you came? To see the body? Yes? All right, then. Let us go to the morgue and see what we shall see." As she and Barrett followed the Commissioner down a seemingly never-ending staircase, it occurred to Nesta that she had never thought about how deep some of the buildings in Bastille went. She had passed by the police headquarters countless times in her life, but she had always thought that what you saw on the street level was all there was of the building. Not so. As they continued their downward trek, Nesta began counting the floors they passed. She had already started too late, but by the time they exited the stairwell and entered the morgue, she had counted 12 floors. And the stairwell hadn't ended there, but continued its downward descent. How far it went was a mystery to her, but she knew only wordsmiths could have built this structure, and it was impressive in its immensity and security. "Here we are," said the Commissioner as they entered the morgue. Every person they passed gave a smart salute to the Commissioner as he passed. In no time at all they had cleared all the security on that level, and had entered the cold room that held any bodies that might be of use to the police in their investigations. Commissioner Blantyre strode immediately to one of the steel doors set in the wall, unlocked it, and pulled the handle to open it. A slab of steel rolled out on extending rails, and upon the slab lay an impossible sight. "Here's the bastard responsible for the death of Bastille's pride and joy," said the Commissioner. "Oh my," gasped Barrett, despite his years of fighting and experience with violent deaths. Nesta nearly fainted. For there on the slab was something almost human, but not. Or perhaps it had been human at one point in time. The police had removed the monster's clothing, revealing the leathery gray skin underneath. It looked mummified. All across the skin were written words of power that Nesta did not understand or recognize. Its abdomen was severely depressed, making it clear that the creature had no internal organs. Its ribs protruded from its side, the skin barely able to contain them. Its hands were so thin, it made the fingers seem longer than what was natural, almost like crocheting needles. But it was the face that was the most disturbing. No eyes rested within its skull, leaving dark pits in their place. The angular cheekbones pulled the taut skin away from the mouth, giving the creature a wicked grin of yellowed teeth sharpened into fangs, and where its nose should be, only a dark cavernous hole remained. "What words of power are written there?" Nesta finally managed to say. The Commissioner shook his head. "That is the question, isn't it? No one seems to know, not even Dom Trombley or Archabbot Matthias." "And equally strange that they would be written on a person," said Barrett. "I wonder if this creature was a human codex, or if those words were written for some other nefarious reason." "I hope the former," said the Commissioner, "because that would mean that the culprit behind the assassination would be dead as well. Rule 7 and all that. But we fear the latter is more likely the case." "Because this creature probably hasn't been truly alive for a while," guessed Nesta. "If I didn't know any better—" She caught herself before saying any more, hoping to keep this information for her own uses in catching the mastermind behind the assassination. "She's a smart one," said the Commissioner to Barrett. "I can see the same wheels turning in her head that turned in mine. Go ahead, Lady Nesta. Go on ahead and say it." Nesta felt foolish for thinking she could outsmart the police commissioner of Bastille. Of course he thought the same thing. She might be smart, but she wasn't the only intelligent person in the Empire. "As far as we are aware, words of power only take effect once written upon the air with quill and ink. Rules 13, 14, and 15. But there are theories that suggest the possibility of transcribing words directly onto physical matter to enact their power. The power of the word would then only affect the thing itself, and not the wider world. But every attempt to test this theory has failed." "Until now," said the Commissioner. "Someone or something out there has figured out how to control corpses with words, and that is a very troubling thought." Nesta couldn't help herself. "Do you have any leads?" she blurted without thinking. Commissioner Blantyre smiled warmly at her. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about that, Lady Nesta. The entire police force of Bastille is on the case. Finding your parents' assassin is our top priority. Once we've got him, you'll be the first to know." "Or her," she said. "It could be a female wordsmith." "Or her," conceded the Commissioner. Nesta nodded her head and politely followed the Commissioner out of the room. To her relief and surprise, they entered a brass elevator and began their upward ascent to the surface. Nesta had never been in an elevator before, though she had heard of the new invention and found it wonderful. However, as the newness of the experience wore off, Nesta found her mind wandering back to that monster in the morgue, and what clues it gave as to the perpetrator she so desperately wanted to find and kill. All this and more flew through Nesta's mind as she found herself seated now alone at a long stone table inside the central keep of King's Code, the imperial palace of Empress Alexandra IV. Today was the day of the reading of her parents' last will and testament. Surrounding the stone table were a flock of nobles, circling her like vultures come to collect their pound of flesh. If she had to guess, they were wondering who would inherit the notes from her parents' most recent expedition. Such notes would be worth a fortune once compiled and printed in book form, or they could be auctioned off to the highest bidder, keeping the knowledge bought at the price of her parents' blood from ever reaching the public for whom it was intended. The greed and arrogance of the nobility stood in stark contrast to Nesta's true intention in hearing the will. Although she knew her parents had not left her words of comfort or guidance in their will, they had made known their last thoughts and desires in their final document, perpetrating something of their life, even in death. To share those final words with the likes of these vultures felt like an invasion of privacy, but she had no power to drive them away. What she did have the power to do, however, was to focus her gaze upon something else entirely. Surrounding the flock of fickle nobles was something far more solid and lasting, the bare rock of the great hall of King's Code. As ancient as it was primitive, the great hall was the core of the citadel and was immensely powerful. For graven into the living stone were words of power beyond count. Down the halls and into each room the words flowed from stone to stone like riverbeds that carried magic instead of water. Not only was King's Code a codex, it was thought to be one of the first, and its wordsmith was the Empress herself. As Empress Alexandra IV walked into the great hall, all stood. Her bare feet slapped the stone in light, high-pitched footfalls that betrayed her youthfulness, not yet 20 years of age. Her hair was bleach blonde, nearly white, and she stood no taller than 5 feet. She wore the black robes of a judge, though fitted perfectly to her frame and made lighter, more flowing. Her eyes were the color of robin eggs, youthful and full of life. but for all her sleight of frame and inexperience, in King's Code she was lady and master. None opposed her. None would dare. Exposing her bare feet follows Rule 11, thought Nesta. The wordsmith must be touching the Codex to use it. And Rule 12 makes sense here. A Codex cannot be used if it is inside another Codex. Even the noble vultures, with all their combined codices, are powerless inside King's Code. And that somehow made her feel better. As the Empress sat at her chair at the head of the stone table, all sat. She waited until all the echoes of their movement ceased, and then she proceeded. As Empress of the Ithalian Empire, Queen of all its territories and dominions, and supreme judge of its laws and statutes, we, Empress Alexandra IV, do hereby commence the reading of the last will and testament of Lord Baltair and Lady Asena Havencroft of Drakmord. Bring forward the will, she commanded in a high but unyielding voice. Lord Brockelman, Chancellor of Ithalia, stepped to the Empress's side and handed her a small scroll with an enormous wax seal bearing the triple dragon crest of House Havencroft upon it. To impress upon all present that no one had read the will before today's public declaration, the Empress took the scroll, broke the wax seal, and unfurled it for all to see. Then she began to read. We, Lord Baltair James Reginald Havencroft, and Lady Asena Cordelia Elizabeth Doltimer Havencroft of Drakmord of the Ithalian Empire, being of sound mind, not acting under duress or undue influence, and knowing that we are bound as Codex and wordsmith to one another, in such wise that if one should perish, both shall, do hereby write, bind, sign, and declare this document to be our last will and testament, and hereby revoke any and all other wills hereforto created by us. As is customary upon the death of a noble of the Ithalian Empire, we declare the current absolute monarch of the empire to be the executor of this will. As supreme judge and arbiter of the law, we discharge them with the duty of publicly reciting our will and executing its wishes. As is customary upon the death of a noble of the Ithalian Empire, we recognize our eldest child, Page Louise Isabella Havencroft Metternich, to inherit Drakmord with all its property, revenues, and titles. Should she have died before this will is enacted, all inheritance due her will be bestowed upon our second child, Nesta Bertha Rose Havencroft. Nesta allowed herself a smile. Ever since she was little, she had hated that her middle name was Bertha, and hearing it now, she was reminded of all the time she would complain to her parents about the name. It had become something of an inside joke with them, what she wouldn't give to complain to them once again. The Empress continued. To Driston Abbey, under the auspices of the Arch-Abbot, we bestow the library of books we have compiled at the Havencroft town-house on Oakmere Lane in Bastille, in the hopes of aiding future wordsmiths trained under their wise guidance of the Church. Books, not notes, clarified the Empress. Nesta looked over at Arch-Abbot Matthias, but instead of being disappointed with the Empress's clarification, he simply bowed, humbly accepting the precious gift of the Havencroft library here in Bastille. She was happy with her parents' decision, for it left the much larger and more exotic library at Drakmord intact for their family. To Gallier Academy, under the auspices of the Academy President, we bestowed the entire collection of artifacts and antiques acquired on our expeditions kept at the Havencroft townhouse on Oakmere Lane in Bastille, to add to the already impressive collection the Academy retains at the National Museum for the edification of the general public and all lovers of knowledge. Nesta expected Don Trombley to be upset by this news, knowing that he wasn't inheriting the much valued notes. But he was smiling, as if there was some inside joke known only to him. The will continued with various charitable donations, as well as small gifts to other friends and family members. But at this point Nesta was starting to get a little agitated. Not that she was expecting much from her parents, but the fact that her name had only been mentioned once, about her succeeding Page if necessary, made her feel small, and a little embarrassed if she was being honest. Here she was, seated amidst the flock of nobles, one of only two daughters to the famed academics and explorers Baltair and Asena Havencroft, and she was essentially inheriting nothing. She shrank in her chair, wanting nothing more than to disappear. Finally, to our second daughter, Nesta Bertha Rose Havencroft, we bequeath our legacy. Those words rang out like a trumpet blast in the great hall. Nesta sat up straight in her chair, leaning slightly forward as the Empress continued. She is to inherit our task of setting the world right, to restore the order of three, to see the sun rise over the southern horizon and watch the moon sink below the northern one, to unravel the scroll and read what is written there. The Empress paused as if wondering if she should continue. Her face was one of confusion, and hers was not alone. Whispers began circulating amongst the nobility. Perhaps her parents weren't of sound mind after all. To aid her in this inheritance, she continued, we also bequeath to her the Lachrymose Codex. It is imprisoned in the crypt below Drakmord and cannot be trusted. It is a codex of incredible power, containing words we do not recognize or understand. It is our wish that she be bound to the Lachrymose Codex, for without it, the tasks she inherits will prove impossible to fulfill. Again the Empress paused. She looked over at Nesta with concern. The following section of the will breaks from the legal code, and it's addressed directly to you, Lady Nesta, the Empress explained before continuing. You must bind the Lachrymose Codex without falling for its trickery, Nesta. You must bind it and use it to restore the world. We are sorry this task has fallen to you, but we love you, and we believe in you. Silence filled the great hall. But silence did not fill Nesta's mind or heart. Confusion did. Confusion and annoyance. Yes, annoyance. She felt guilty being annoyed with her now-deceased parents, but annoyed she most certainly was. Angry even. Why hadn't they told her? Inheriting their legacy? Setting the world right? Lachrymose Codex? And after she poured all that time and trauma and tears into creating her own codex, hers. She had worked for 3 months on that codex. All the greatest wordsmiths created their own codex by hand. How dare they take that away from her? She was supposed to have been bound to her codex on her 16th birthday, which was weeks ago now. But she had delayed it as a sign of respect and mourning. Now she was being told that she would never be bound to her own codex, and that it was her parents' last command. "What about their notes from the expedition?" cried out an anonymous voice from the crowd of nobles. A clamor of voices followed. Some agreed with the first, demanding to know about the notes. Others decried the entire question, seeing it as a breach of decorum and entirely inappropriate. Suddenly, as if all the sound had been snatched away by invisible hands, a complete and absolute silence filled the hall. The mouths of the many nobles continued moving as if talking, but no words came forth. Only after a few seconds did they close their mouths, and then all eyes were on the Empress, a golden quill in her right hand, a bottle of violet ink in her left, and a word hanging on the air. She wrote a second word, and the low sound of breathing and clothes rustling returned to the space. "Enough," she said, her voice filled with irritation and disappointment. "We received a signed and sealed addendum to the will only hours before Lord and Lady Havencroft left their townhouse to attend the lecture at Gallier Academy," explained the Empress. As if on cue, Lord Bockelman walked up to the Empress and handed her a second, much smaller scroll. Again she broke the seal, unrolled it, and read, "In addendum and addition to all contained in the last will and testament signed by our names and sealed with our seal, we, Baltair James Reginald Havencroft and Asena Cordelia Elizabeth Doltimer Havencroft, do bequeath all notes from our expeditions to our second daughter, Nesta Bertha," there was that wretched name again, "Rose Havencroft, for use in her aforementioned inheritance. May they serve her well." Lord Bockelman strode over to Nesta, holding a large leather-bound journal with a triple dragon crest emblazoned upon its cover. Nesta wasn't sure if she should be relieved or distressed at having acquired the notes. On the one hand, they seemed to be closely connected to the mission her parents imposed upon her to continue their legacy. Perhaps there would be more clues within them on what she was supposed to do next. On the other hand, she knew that every noble in that room would be inquiring of her whether or not she would be willing to sell them. Some might even go so far as to hire a thief against her. Either way, this journal was dangerous. "Thus concludes the public declaration of the last will and testament of Lord Baltair and Lady Asena Havencroft of Drakmord," announced the Empress. She gave a nod to the steward standing at attention near the door. A bell was rung, and all the nobles knew this to be their dismissal from the great hall, and indeed from King's Code. Nesta stood and began to depart with the nobility. "Lady Nesta," said the Empress in a soft but commanding voice, "we would request an audience with you once we are alone." Nesta stopped, turned around, and made a polite curtsy. It would be an honor. Once all had left, and only Nesta and the Empress remained, Alexandra motioned for Nesta to be seated at the table, as she herself took the seat next to her. "How are you doing?" said the Empress in a soft voice. "Your Majesty? Please, for just this moment, I am not your Empress, but a friend who is only a few years older than you and knows what it is to lose one's parents, to lose a mom and a dad. I was 9 when it happened. The Malachik fever. First my father, then 2 weeks later my mother. Everyone kept saying they were sorry, mainly because there's very little else to be said, and although I appreciated the gesture, all I really wanted was to be left alone with my grief. All I wanted to feel the pain of it. I wanted the time to sit with my tears and not be consoled. I wanted it to hurt. Why? Because I loved them, and they deserved to be missed that much." Tears began to roll down Nesta's cheek, for this is exactly how she felt. She looked over at Alexandra and saw that she was crying too. With complete disregard toward protocol or propriety, Nesta flung herself at Alexandra, wrapping her arms around her in an embrace. "Thank you," she whispered into the Empress's ear. And there they sat, grieving together, feeling the pain together, crying together. And Nesta was at peace. Not happy, not content, not numb. Still terribly sad, but a sadness tempered by peace. "There now," said Alexandra as they separated. "I don't receive hugs very often, so I cherish the few I do." "And I will cherish the kind words you shared with me," said Nesta, sniffling from the tears, "for they give me permission and even encouragement to feel as awful as I do." "It never completely goes away," said Alexandra. "The miserable feeling will always be a part of you now. Time does not heal all wounds, but some wounds deepen us and allow us to love more fully." As Nesta walked out of King's Code and into the bright quarter sun afternoon, she felt relieved. For the first time since that awful night when the monstrous thing fell from the ceiling and shot her mom and dad, she felt like someone understood her. She felt she wasn't entirely alone anymore. And from the Empress, no less. Perhaps in spite of the tragedy, she could focus on the future. The future. 2 things stood out as most paramount where the future was concerned. 1, deciding whether she should honor her parents' wishes to be bound to the Lachrymose Codex or to be bound to her own codex made with her own hands. Or 2, investigating the death of her parents and who was ultimately responsible for it. "Lady Nesta," said a gentleman, interrupting her thoughts as she reached the bottom of the palace steps. "Lady Nesta, I represent Lord Petrichor, owner of the Bastille Bank. Lady Nesta, he would like very much to arrange a meeting with you to discuss payment options for the debts incurred by House Havencroft over these past many years." Payment options? Nesta was jarred back to reality by the horrid phrase. "Lady Nesta," said the nameless gentleman, as if repeating her name would keep her attention, "my lord is not a patient man. Please accompany me immediately to—" But he was promptly interrupted by 2 other gentlemen who had arrived at the bottom of the palace steps, both also saying her name multiple times in succession. "Lady Nesta," said the second man as he forced an envelope into her hands, "this is a summons for House Havencroft to honor its promise to pay back the debt to the Manufacturers' Guild for the production of custom equipment used during their expeditions. You have 30 days to comply." "Lady Nesta," said the third man, "I represent Lord Fairfax, speculator and entrepreneur. Lady Nesta, my lord is very interested in acquiring your parents' notes and journals from their expedition, and he is willing to pay handsomely for their acquisition. Here is his business card, should you wish for a meeting." By now 5 more gentlemen had arrived, each either reporting a debt owed or a buyer's proposal. Nesta was thoroughly overwhelmed. Without a second thought, she did what she always did when overwhelmed, bored, or stressed. She walked. A veritable parade of gentlemen followed, each waving their scrap of paper or that, yelling out after her as she had if she had any interest at all in what they had to say. She did not. Instead, the only interest she had was quickening her pace and getting as lost as possible in the winding streets and back alleys of Bastille. Soon enough they all got the message, and one by one they left the parade. By the time the last one finally gave in, Nesta was exhausted. The peace she had felt with the Empress had entirely evaporated, and only confusion and fear remained. Payment plans, she thought. Debts. Proposals to buy the very notes that might hold some clues as to who killed my parents and what a Lachrymose Codex is. Does Paige know the situation of our house? Does Barrett? If only I could escape for a while and be alone with my thoughts. And just then she looked up and saw where her feet had taken her. It was their townhouse on Oakmere Lane. It must have been instinct that led her there. She ran inside, up the stairs and into her bedroom, throwing herself upon the bed, under the stained glass window of the Three Dragons of House Havencraft. She wept.